Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for joining us late in the evening, early in the evening, depending on where you are, for this presentation of legal aspects of clinical practice transitions in 2021, presented by Art Wiederman and Wood. Bit of housekeeping notes to begin with. If you have any questions or comments for Art or Beck, please utilize the chat function at the top of your screen or the bottom, depending on if you're on the web. They will work and make sure that they're getting your guys' questions answering. Thank you, Kanika. The voices were echoing a bit, like it might be rectified. If you're still hearing that, please let us know. But without further ado, I will go ahead and turn our time over to Art and Patrick.
Thank you, Amanda, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our Business for Dentistry, a series for success. And this is one of 3 different tracks that we are doing for the 6 local dental societies that are participating in this series. We're doing a 12-month series, folks, which is on the business of dentistry. By the way, I should introduce myself. Go ahead, Amanda, put up the 2 of our pictures. My name is Art Wiederman. I'm a dental director at the CPA firm of Eide Bailly. I'm located out of Tustin, California. And tonight you're going to be hearing very little of me and a lot of my very, very close friend, colleague for over 30 years, Pat Wood, who is a dental attorney. I'll introduce him in a moment. So Amanda, go ahead and go to the next slide, if you would. So for those of you who are sitting in, this is the 3rd webinar of our series. There's going to be 19 in total. This particular webinar is the first of 4 in the series on navigating the transition minefield, we call it. It's going to be everything that you want to know tonight about the legal aspects of transitions. This will be the 3rd Wednesday of every month. So the next one will be me putting it on, and that's going to be, I believe that date is February the 21st. Yes, I'm sorry, February the 17th. And then in March the 17th, will be Kathleen Johnson, who's a dental management consultant. We'll be talking about the management and due diligence issues of buying a practice and selling a practice. And then on April the 21st, we'll have Justin Klingshirn from Bank of America talking about financing for buying a dental practice. So what I want to do right now is, first of all, I want to thank the amazing 6 executive directors of the dental societies that are participating in this series. So we have from the Harbor Dental Society, we have Krista Navina. We have from the Orange County Dental Society, Megan Francis. We have Lee Adishian from the San Gabriel Valley Dental Society. We have Michelle Schneider from the West Los Angeles Dental Society. Kurt Thornton from the San Fernando Valley Dental Society, and Greg Orloff from the Los Angeles Dental Society. I want to thank all 6 of these wonderful, amazing executive directors of these dental societies who have helped, along with Amanda and Jessica and all the folks at Eide Bailly, to bring you this webinar series. So tonight we start the 4 tracks on transitions, and I want to give you well, in a minute I'll give you a little history of how we've done this, but I just want to give you a couple of updates on our favorite subject, PPP and HHS and all this stuff. So just a couple things you need to know. For those of you who got PPP loans of under $150,000 in the first round in 2020, the application for forgiveness, the simplified 1-page attestation, came out at about midnight Washington, D.C. time last night. It is available on the SBA's website. So many of your banks are going to be getting that up onto their portals, and you'll be able to file if you have less than $150,000 of a PPP loan. So be aware of that. The second round of PPP loans has been authorized by the December 27th stimulus bill. Many banks are already accepting applications, and basically you have until March 31st to apply for this. It's pretty much the same drill as round 1, but be aware of that. And the last thing I want to remind everybody about is that if you received any money from the Department of Health and Human Services or the HHS Provider Relief Fund, the portal has opened up to report the expenses that you spent that money on. And those expenses have to be reported by February 15th. We think there's a chance, a good chance, that they may extend that, because right now all you can do is register for that portal. They do not have the portal set up that you could put in the amount of money that you spent on things like PPE and ventilation equipment, et cetera. And we'll be reporting back to you on that. Next slide, please, Amanda. Amanda, thank you. So what I want to do is share with you the fact that I do a weekly podcast called The Art of Dental Finance and Management. I know many of you hopefully listen to it, and I've been doing it for a little over 2 years. This coming Wednesday, a week from today, I'm going to be doing another hour-long update on my podcast on the brand new PPP rules and the forgiveness rules. The SBA came out with a bunch of new rules and regulations and rules of the road in the past 2 days. It's kind of like, you know, I go, I have lunch, there's new rules. I go, I have dinner, there's new rules. That's how it works these days. So this is a way for you to get the up-to-date information, and you can subscribe to the podcast. Go onto your podcast app and you can subscribe. Just put in The Art of Dental Finance and Management. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to give the rest of my time to my very good friend and colleague, Pat Wood. So many, many years ago, Pat and I, and as I mentioned earlier, Kathleen Johnson, who's a dental consultant, we started doing live seminars. Wow, that was a great time when we were able to do live seminars. And we would rent a hotel room and provide lunch, and we do an all-day seminar. And about the first 2 hours, Pat Wood, who you're going to meet tonight, would talk about the legal aspects of transitions. Then I would spend 2 hours, and we break that up over lunch, and I talk about, you know, valuation of a dental practice. I'm not only a dental CPA, but a dental practice broker also. So we talk about valuation. What do buyers look for? What should sellers be looking for? How do the tax laws work when you sell your practice, when you buy a practice? The third webinar, the third 2 hours was Kathleen talking about what should a dentist do to get ready for a sale, and what should a buyer be looking for when they go in and look at the charts. And then the last one, we bring in a bank. We've been working with Bank of America, and they bring one of their folks in and talk about, you know, loans and all of that. So when I was talking to the dental societies, I said to them, you know, why don't we just do this, except we'll break it out into 4 pieces. So that's exactly what we've done. Pat and Kathleen and B of A and I have been doing this for, I think, 15 years, and it's been very successful, and it's really good information. So tonight you're going to hear Pat Wood talking to, and go ahead, Amanda, and turn over the control of the PowerPoint to Pat. So Pat Wood is a dental specific attorney with the law firm of Wood and Delgado out of Lake Forest, California. Pat works all over the country in all 50 states. And so doctors, I know that in your practices, if you're a general dentist, you have your go-to periodontist, and you have your go-to endodontist, you have your go-to orthodontist that you refer to, that you have great confidence in. Well, in my world, I work with bankers, I work with consultants, and I do a lot of work with attorneys, and I generally work only with dental specific attorneys. And Pat Wood is my specialist that I refer to. He's the kind of guy, folks, that if there's a question that's really complicated, not only does he have the answer, but he makes it understandable and easy, and it's just really comfortable, and he takes really good care of our clients. So I know that you're going to get some great information tonight. We're going to be talking about the legal aspects, both for buyers and for sellers, the purchase and sale of a dental practice. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to my good friend, Pat Wood. Pat, it's all yours.
Thank you, Art. And that was a very, very kind introduction you did. I'm not
Wednesday
sure
is my kind day, Pat. Wednesday is my kind day.
Lucky me. I thought it was your golf day.
Yeah, well, that too. So there you go.
So, hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about a number of things tonight, and there's going to be some overlap with what Art does, because we all have our different take on how things happen. I'm going to start with, in fact, let me, how do I get the screen to come down, Art?
Amanda, can you help us with the screen here?
Uh-oh.
Yep, 1 second.
Yeah, it looks like I've lost mine.
Is that how you want it, Pat?
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so yes, there are a number of things that I want to talk about with you, and they're not all exactly legal, because I think people start to fall asleep out there when they hear just legal. I'm going to talk about who the buyers are out there. I'm going to talk about who the sellers are. Naturally, when we're talking about buyers and we're talking about sellers, we're also talking about DSOs. So I'm going to talk about the DSOs and what part they have to do with the sale of dental practices. I'm going to, I too will give you my concept of how we are valuing and how we're seeing people value dental practices. It may be a little different from Art's, but I think we're basically coming to the same point, and that is the practice profitable? If it's profitable, and it's in a good area, you're probably going to be able to sell it. And if you're out in, I don't know, Bakersfield or Fresno, you might have a difficult time selling it. So I'm going to talk about those things. I'll talk about what the buyer's concerns typically are. I'm going to talk about what the seller's concerns are, and things that you need to look at. I'll try to add some case studies, some things that we've worked on over the years. Some are a little shocking to us. Some are just, how things go. And then I'm going to try to summarize what the concerns are from the buyer and from the seller. Now, as we do talk tonight, Art and I were talking about this earlier. We would like to be able to, every 10 minutes or 20 minutes, be able to take any items that you guys have brought up and respond to them. So if you can kind of hold on to it for 10 or 20 minutes, we'll certainly take whatever the issues are that are important to you and try our best to give you an answer that makes sense to us. So
yeah, and you can, folks, you can put your questions into the chat, and we'll take a break every so often, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can.
So who are your buyers and who are your sellers? And Amanda, this is still not working.
Can you scroll down on the left side, the little bar?
Yeah, it's not quite scrolling, dude. Okay, I'm seeing the DSO. Oh man.
Bear with us, folks.
Yeah. These things are always interesting. You're never sure what's going to go wrong. You're just sure something is going to go wrong.
Okay.
As it is right now.
You want to let Amanda take the screen, Pat?
Absolutely. It's all yours, Amanda.
Okay, so let's go to the first slide. DSOs.
DSOs. So what are DSOs? I think we all know who they are. They're the guys with a lot of money in their pockets. They're a very significant part of who the buyers are of practices. We mentioned some at the bottom of the page. Heartland does like to go out and buy practices. Pacific Dental doesn't like to do that. It just depends really on who you're dealing with. But you're certainly, as sellers of dental practices, you should expect that you're going to be confronted with a DSO that gets interested in your practice. Now, if a DSO likes your practice and wants to acquire it, understand that there's going to be some strings attached. They don't just simply buy your practice typically. There are a few that do, but generally they're going to want you to stick around for a period of time. And you may or may not want to do that. I'm working with a guy, I think Art, you just landed him as a client. And he did not want to stick around for very long. He has been approached by one of the big guys here. And the deal may not go through because if the buyer is not happy with his level of commitment, they may try to change it, and they may either back away or try to reduce what the price is. So, keep that in mind. It can be a problem. Okay. Man, I'm still having this problem. So if you can just drop down. Are DSOs legal? In most states, they're going to be. Actually, there are 3 states in the United States where you don't even have to be a dentist to own the practice. Most of them, however, want the security of knowing that there's going to be a dentist that's in charge of things in the back room. They're generally going to have some odd things like, Florida, for instance, has no problem with you being a DSO and owning all the equipment, but they do have a problem with you, the DSO, being able to transfer that on to the patient records to another buyer. They have a very strict feeling that if you're doing that, you're controlling the thing. New Jersey has something somewhat similar to that. But what I'm saying is that these are specific to the state that you're operating in. And so I don't know how many people here are from out of the state of California. I know some of you are. I'll try to keep it generally to California law and what California looks at on these things. But certainly if anybody has one that's specific to a state they're in, by all means, bring that up as part of the chat. Are these things legal? Yeah, they're legal. If you comply with whatever the law is of that state. And that's going to be different. You may have heard of the Aspen case. That was a case that arose in New York. I thought it was a rather long 74-page opinion, and they laid out, in my mind, how most DSOs should be operating. If you wanted to take a look at that, it's very easy to find it on your internet. You could do that and it'd give you an idea as to whether they're doing it. One of the things that I worry about, as a dental attorney, is that generally these guys don't want you looking at their documents. And if you don't look at their documents, how do you know that they're in compliance? I had a gentleman he had a series of DSO documents, practices. He was his headquarters were in Colorado, but he was also in Utah. He was also in Arizona. And, I said, can I see your documents? Because I'm not sure I want my client to go in this direction unless I know you're doing it right. And, he really didn't want to give it to me. Finally, I got my hands on it and I said, oh my God, this guy's not doing it properly. And, I could have probably gotten the thing changed around, but I really couldn't get cooperation from the owner of the practice. And so my client, unfortunately, just ended up passing on it because he knew he would not be in compliance with California law. Amanda, can we drop down? These are their basic requirements. You have to have a management agreement between the doctor and the DSO. A fee gets paid to the DSO. It's got to be reasonable. It has to be something that's based on profits. It can, however, be based on the practice profits. Generally, in California, you can only pay the DSO based on how much money the DSO brought in for that state. That's going to vary according to what state you're in. But certainly in California, it's written right into the statute. It's got to be based on that. So those of you who are buyers who are out there, just make sure that you get them to disclose this. I try to put it into the document and say that, you know, we're in compliance with the following. Sometimes I'm kind of giving away a little more than I need to, but I'd much rather have them know what they're supposed to be doing than them not knowing and having the DSO perhaps mislead them. Amanda, next one. So I started doing DSOs back in about 91 or 92. And there was a guy here in California, Art knows him well. He's one of the top 3 DSOs in the country. And at that time, he just had a single DSO out in the desert. And his dad had taken it back. It had been something his dad had run for years. He sold it to a buyer, carried paper, and of course it defaulted. And so Steve was his name, took that over. And that's how I first got involved with him. Not as his attorney, but as an outside counsel. I handled his partnership things on behalf of his partners. The name of that group is Pacific Dental. I think they're a very good outfit. I think generally most of these outfits operate within the parameters of what they're trying to do. Doesn't mean they all do. And if you're the buyer in particular, you have to be careful about that. If you're the seller, I'm not sure that you have to be quite as concerned. Now, the last time I looked this up, there were more than 20,000 dentists working for the DSOs. I'm not certain what it is now. That was a couple of years ago. I was doing a seminar with Art and his people. I do know that Shine and Patterson say that 15 to 20% of all their sales are going to the DSOs. So be aware that this is an entity that is not going to go away. It's only going to get bigger and bigger. Amanda?
And Pat, I also notice a lot of these DSOs in the specialty groups are getting more aggressive about directly contacting oral surgeons and endodontists and periodontists and that. I'm seeing a lot of that too.
Yeah, and what they are doing now, they didn't do this, I'd say, for the first 20 years. They are going out and acquiring specialty groups. They're just saying, we don't care that much about the general. We like the specialty. Maybe one of our guys is very good at handling that type of specialty. So you are going to see that. Amanda, if we go to the next one. So we were talking about who is it that's doing this? Who are the buyers? We did a study. It wasn't a study. It was directly from the American Dental Association magazine. And they said at the time, and this goes back 5 years, that 60% of the dentists were under the age of 44 and were women. We do know, and for those who are in the seminar tonight, you probably know that when you look out at SC or UCLA or one of the others, you're going to see probably more females than you do males. Maybe you women are smarter than us. I don't know. But you're certainly in the schools much more so than you were in the past. Female dentists are much less likely to practice. At the time we did this, it was 36 versus 53. They're 50% more likely to be comfortable being long-term associate. Now remember, these aren't my figures. This is coming directly from the ADA. 80% of the graduating members of a couple of schools here have told us they don't want to own their own practice, which to me is alarming. I mean, why would you go to dental school? Why would you go to any professional school and not be the one that's in charge of what's going on at that place? We know that the average debt has gone up. In 2011, it was 213. I checked 2018. The figure was more like 260. And so, you sometimes wonder, how can these guys continue to jump into the field when it's going to take them years to pay all this off?
Well, Pat, the California dental schools are significantly higher than that, as we all know. I mean, UOP, USC, you're looking, $400,000 or $500,000. If you go for a GPR, it's higher. So, it's the averages are national averages because the dental schools in other states are less expensive. But here in California, like everything else, it's a lot more expensive.
That's true. Amanda? So the young dentist is typically saddled with a lot of debt, like we're talking about. They have to make a career choice that's based primarily on what their financial security is going to be. What we're seeing is that within the last 10 years, that the people that I lecture at 5 of the different general dentistry schools and a handful of the residency schools throughout the country. And I can tell you that people really would prefer to jump into a DSO initially. And I think there are good reasons for it. I think they get better training initially. But that seems to be where a lot of them are looking at. Amanda? So the growing impact. Nobody's really clear on, is it 20%? Is it 30%? We don't know exactly what it is because not everybody wants to tell us. But we do know that back in about 2012, ADA commissioned 4 different dentists to come up with where they saw dentistry going vis-a-vis DSOs in the next, I think then 15 years through 2025. And 2 of the authors said they thought by 2025, it could be up to 50% of all dentists that were in the DSO structure, which again, I mean, it's very surprising to me, but that's what's going on out there. Looking at the 10 largest group practices, which comprise roughly 5,000 to 6,000 dental practices, we found roughly 9,000 affiliated dentists. We saw the revenue was quite high. I think 3 of them are doing more than $1 billion a year. I mean, there's really some large money involved here. Amanda? So who are they? We've got, of course, Smile Brands, Pacific Dental, Heartland, and Aspen, Affordable Care, Interdent, who we do a lot of work with. And these are the guys who are essentially taking over a segment of what is out there. And so if you're a seller, you need to be aware that these people may approach you. And it may not be a bad thing, other than they probably want you to stick around longer than you wanted to. Amanda? Okay, so let's talk about some different types of practice modalities. The solo practice, I think the majority of practices in the country are solo practices. It's a good thing. We hope it continues like that. There are quite a few of those that are operated through partnerships. You have the small group practice, where you might have 1 or 2 dentists in that practice. And then, of course, you have the large group practice, which is really another way of saying DSOs. And, they are, like you said, they're out there and they're not going away. Amanda. Okay, the upsides to corporate dentistry. And hey, listen, I hear this from the people that are in the schools. They say, I'd rather go to work for, you name it, whoever it is, because they're going to pay me more money. And why would I go make 120 when I got in California 400,000 in debt? Doesn't make sense. So they look for the bigger DSOs and they go there. Now, I have sat in on these training workshops that these guys do. And they do a very good job of training the doctor on how to get case acceptance from the patients that they bring in. And it's pretty interesting to me because I'm not a dentist. I see what my dentist does, but I don't really emphasize this. When I want to, I've been to a couple of them. I was surprised at how good they were at teaching people to get the person that was sitting in the chair to accept the case that they were offering. I also saw that there's a quicker development of the dental schools, because what I saw is that roughly most of them are working as much as 90% of the time they're in the practice doing dentistry. For those doctors out there that are in private practice, you have a lot of other issues that you have to deal with. And so you don't have as much time to necessarily work in the practice. Amanda? So the downside to this. One thing that the DSOs do is they want to take people and push them. If they see a root canal, they really don't want the general dentist doing it if they don't have to. They're going to try to push it into the specialists. Same thing with other types of things. And so what happens is, over a period of time, the general dentist working in one of these places is not going to be as developed in their skills. I was lecturing in the Southwest Conference some years back, and it was one of those weird days where I don't think I was that good. I think they were that interested in corporate dentistry, and I couldn't get them to leave. They stayed 90 minutes after, even though it was cocktail hour, which I found amusing. And one woman in the back said, she was from Arizona, and she said, when I went through dental school in Arizona, my husband decided he would go into private practice. My brother, who was also going through this with us, decided he would go to work for, and I won't name him, but one of the very biggest players out there. And what she had to say, now she was obviously supporting her man and to be expected, but she said that she thought her brother was, although making good money, he was making $400 a year at that time. She thought that he felt, because he was working in a big DSO, that he hadn't really developed his skills the way that he wanted to. He had to keep the pressure of the workload. He had to be there 5 days a week. So I thought that he was doing, he was kind of facing the reality. And I think a lot of people face the reality of, if you choose corporate dentistry, you are choosing that you're not going to be doing everything that you might otherwise do. She said her husband, by contrast, was pretty happy with what he's doing. He was making about the same. This is 10 years out. And he liked the fact that he could just, a couple of days before, call it in and reschedule everybody and go do whatever it was he wanted to do that day. And so, I got that. I don't know what her brother would have said about this. He might have said, that's not true. It's a wonderful place to work. But, it was a different way of looking at it. Okay, next slide. Okay, let's start talking about the values of the practices. I started doing this in the 80s. There really were no historical dental lenders. You would have to go down to a local bank. The local bank would tell you what they're willing to loan and not willing to loan. What I saw was a lot of people would just close the practice, particularly if they weren't doing real well. They couldn't just offload this on somebody unless they had a pretty strong practice. I think what happened, I've been told this by a couple of people, one of the founders of the B of A group and one of the founders of, they're now owned by Wells Fargo,
Owned by Wells Fargo?
Yeah, they're owned by Wells Fargo now. It was the dental group that they bought. Anyhow, those guys said that in the early 90s, they saw that the Wall Street had really accepted the idea of there being corporate dentistry. And that led in turn to a ton of people that were corporate and not really dentists per se. And that's certainly been what we've seen, and it continues. Okay, next slide. So traditionally, the way we looked at this is you set a range, and whether it was 40 to 85 or 60 to 90, it didn't matter. You had brokers coming out and saying, if you're doing, and you'll still hear this today, by the way, when you go to your next dental convention, if there ever is another dental convention, start talking to the brokers. They're not going to ask you so much how much you're making, but they are going to ask you how much are you doing. They're going to ask you what kind of practice do you have, what percentage of that is Medi-Cal, what percentage is fee for service. They're trying to come up with what the value is. And you're going to find that, of course, they're going to want to talk to you a lot more if you're doing $1.5 million and it's all fee for service. But they're going to be looking at this, and they're going to try to come up with what the actual value is of your practice. And historically, it had been based on collections. Amanda? Next slide.
Next slide.
Okay. When you go to a broker, and Art doesn't do that, thank God, but I'll tell you, just about everybody else does in California. You ask them to do an appraisal. They'll do an appraisal for you. But I can tell you that 2 of the 3 components they typically use, they learned in appraisal school. And one of them is asset approach. This is the same thing you would do if you were selling a business. You would try to look at the value of the assets, the equipment, the instruments, the goodwill, and come up with what the value was. This is very subjective. I had a guy that longtime professor at UCLA. Finally got him to buy a practice. He did. It was the most bizarre thing in that we had 2 different dental practice brokers come out that day and give valuations. I won't say who they were. It wasn't Art. It wasn't Phil Potter. And the one broker said it was worth 8.25. The other broker said it was worth $450. So I mean, you tell me, how scientific is that? I don't think they are. Next. Okay. Then the second one is the market approach. Now, this is something you see if you happen to have ever had a commercial real estate or a residential real estate background, you'd see that they go to appraisals that show up on the MLSs and other services. I don't think it's fair to try to value a dental practice based on a market approach, because you don't always know. You're not always comparing apples to apples. I think it's very difficult to try to utilize this format. And so generally, we push people not to do that. Next slide. These are some of the reasons why it's not a great idea to go this route. It's not going to take into for instance, and as Art would tell you, if the seller got all the tax benefits, if he got 95%, like somebody told me the other day that the seller should get, you're going to write this stuff off over 15 years. That's not real good if you're a buyer. The seller could be, and this happened to me years ago, the seller said, I'm just going to take a few patients. Well, we finally got the list of the patients, and it was 50 people. We didn't know much about it, so I had my appraiser, the person that was looking at the value of the practice on behalf of the buyer, went in there and said, these are big cases. These aren't little cases that they're taking. So fortunately, we were able to get out of that deal. Also, you run in, sometimes the seller wants to hold on to his position there. That generally isn't going to work out real well, I will tell you. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but it's not, in my opinion, the best way to go. Next page. The current valuation approach, and this is one I think Art would agree on. This is really based on how much are you, the doctor, netting from the operation of the practice. I'm not talking about how much did you bring in. You could bring in $2 million. We had a guy like this not that long ago, but he was only making $100,000. And we, of course, said, you know, this makes no sense. You have to completely change this, not have all specialists doing this, et cetera. You know, the practice got sold, but it was a very unusual one. This is typically going to be based on the bottom line. How much did you, the doctor, make at the end of the day? And if you were making a sufficient amount of income, then you're not going to have a problem selling it at somewhere, you know, within, I throw out a 150 to 300 true net income. It just depends on where you're doing it. Now, if you're in the middle of the New Mexico desert, you're probably not even going to get 150,000. Same is true. I sold some kind of specialty practice. I was the attorney on it. It was in St. Louis. It was some time back, but the seller came to me. He was doing $850 a year. He was netting 500, and he was trying to sell it for 250. And I said, Doctor, that's just way outside of what is normal. You should be selling it for a lot more. And he said, Pat, have you ever lived in St. Louis? I said, no, I haven't. But, you know, it did teach me, don't assume too much. Okay, Amanda, next. Okay, so let's talk about how do you actually make these offers? What I like to do is a simple letter of intent. And letter of intent is something where you could decide, you know, these are the terms that matter to me. This is what and I like to make it very simple. I like to do 2 pages. I don't like to do what a lot of brokers in the country do, where they give you something, not a lot, but I'd say a significant number, will try to give you what is really a binding agreement. And if you don't catch everything, you're going to end up with being stuck in a practice acquisition that you hadn't really looked at properly. Art, I said we'd try to go to questions and answers. I see there is one on there.
Yeah, we do have a question, and it's basically says, can you comment on what's a good non-compete for a seller where the buyer's paying 25 to 30% premium for the practice? 5 years, 15 miles. Are you going to cover covenants not to compete in later slide?
We do cover it. I would just throw out one caveat, and that is most states are not going to enforce it if they think it is overly broad. I don't care where you are. I had somebody in a state that once wanted it to be a covenant that covered the entire state. I said, that makes no sense. And he said, oh, I have to have it. I have to have it. Well, I represented the buyer, and I said, I think that you ought to just make it the whole United States, because it's not going to be enforceable whether it's this large
I had one
state.
guy want to do 4 states. So yeah, it's got to be reasonable in most instances. And Pat, don't we usually see 3 years, 10 to 15 miles? And I guess it really depends on, you know, if I'm out in the Apple Valley, it's maybe different than if I'm selling a practice in Santa Monica or Newport Beach, where they're, you know, I mean,
or Manhattan, or you know, Denver. Yeah, it's going to be different according to where you are. And so, you know, rely on your attorney to try to give you some advice. But if you get overly, concerned about what that is, you may take what would otherwise be an enforceable covenant and make it unenforceable.
Pat, there's one more question, and you had made a comment earlier, taking the position that a partnership is a dangerous way to do business. Why this nice doctor is asking, why is partnership practice most dangerous?
Well, unless you know your partner well, this is where I see the danger. The people don't really know each other that well. It might be two, it could be three. If they don't start out with something in common, if they don't know what the lifetime goals are of the two doctors, what the practice goals are, how they're going to be operating the practice, they may find out 3-4 months into it that they're coming from a completely different stage. And if they are doing that, it might make it difficult, not impossible, but it could be quite difficult to operate that thing in a way that makes sense. So,
it's kind of like it's a marriage is what it is.
It sure is.
Yep.
And you better know who your partner is before you marry he or she.
Unfortunately, Pat, you and I have been in many partnership divorces with dentists over the years, and they don't end up very well in many cases.
No, they don't. Amanda, next. Okay, let's talk about an associate buy-in. I will kind of, I hope none of those people are out there from some of those large places throughout the country that sell. They have these ideas that I don't think make a lot of sense, but they'll come in and they'll try to sell the practice. I can think of two of them that will sell it at first year, you pay for 10%. Next year, you pay for 20%. Third year, doesn't work out too well if you're going to a dental practice lender. They want to make that loan all at once. Doesn't work out too well for the associate because the associate really has no control for a period of time. The property vesting is what I'm really getting at. Now, I'll give you a perfect example of one that Art and I actually worked on this together. And it was, you know how you get those brilliant ideas at 3 in the morning because you can't sleep. Well, I was in, of all places, Kauai, which is in the state of Hawaii. And I just could not get this thing out of my mind. I had sent my buyer to a broker that I knew, and he somehow got involved in the deal. He came up with a price. Then the seller went to a convention and heard somebody with a great idea on how to do this. And it was one of these stepped in things. And the seller was going to take the payments as ordinary income. But then he got an equalization payment because he was not going to get the benefit of having the goodwill sale. And, you know, I kept saying, well, there's something wrong here. And I called Art and I said, I think the buyer's kind of getting screwed here. And Art immediately said, yes, he is. He's not going to be able to write anything off. And so I think we determined in that case, it was a big practice, by the way. We determined he was probably paying way too much. And we ultimately went back to that broker, a guy that Art and I know well. He's up in the Bay Area. And we were able to get him back involved in it, and it worked out well. Next one, Amanda.
Amanda, thanks.
Okay. Let's start talking about what the concerns are from a seller standpoint. Well, I'd say just as a general rule, the smaller your practice is, the harder it's going to be to sell your practice. If you're only doing 300,000 or 400,000, the brokers don't even want to talk to you in many cases. I'm not saying in every one, and I'm not saying, you know, depending on the size of your town, they won't do it. But I can just tell you that the bigger it is, the more likely they are to take it on. There's also the issue of a lot of people getting out of school. They want to stay in an area where things are really happening. And that means, obviously, that they want to stay in the city. That means if you're in in our case, let's call it Fresno, you're probably going to have a hard time selling that practice because not a lot of people want to move to Fresno. They're going to want instead to stay in a place where they have a lot of friends and they have a lot going on. And so, that becomes a problem. The value of the practices may drop over a period of time if demand drops. There's also the issue of you may have a practice, let's say it's doing 500. You may have a practice doing 500 and you might even be doing 200 in profit, which isn't bad. The thing I'd say there, doctors, is if you can find a way to take that practice and make that practice look a lot better, not only should the revenue go up, but it's just going to look better for a buyer. The buyer's going to say, this guy's really taking care of things. Some other concerns, and this one I cannot overemphasize, and that is for your sellers. When you sign your lease, I can guarantee you that unless you negotiated it, you're going to remain on the hook until the lease is up. And typically, in order to sell the lease, sell the practice, you have to have a long-term lease, which is going to be more than 5 years. And so if you are sitting here today thinking about this, you might want to just open up your lease and see what you have in the lease, because I think you're going to find that you're going to remain liable under the lease. And if you happen to be negotiating a lease, which I do all day long with these people, that's one of the first things I go to. I say, let's knock this out. And usually we can get it so, well, you can either buy it out or we'll release you at the end of the current term and not keep you going forever. I did have somebody today, an attorney on another deal outside of California, and he said, I couldn't get the landlord to be reasonable, and so my client is going to be on the hook, the seller, for 18 years. It was a series of, basically 4 options, and he was in the first option. So be careful about that. We have
Pat,
4.
Yeah, we have some more questions. I want to jump in with one comment. No disrespect to anybody on this webinar who is a landlord. I'm sure all of you are very nice, and we like it when you own the building because it makes it a lot easier for the sale. But as a broker, it is my opinion that many landlords are evil human beings and they are all out for money. Pat, do we have the slide about the one where I got to deliver the check later on, or is that in your presentation?
Would that be a certain somebody in Indiana?
It would be.
Okay.
Is that in your presentation?
That is towards the end. We'll talk about it.
Okay, so we'll get to, that's a teaser. But folks, I will tell you, Pat, here's the worst nightmare. Someone comes to me and they want to sell their practice and they have 2 months left on their lease. And I'm sure there are people listening on this webinar who are coming down to the last 6 months of their lease and they want to sell and they don't want to sign another 5-year lease. What do we tell them?
Depends on how strong your buyer is. If you come in with a real strong buyer and the landlord or the current tenant isn't that strong, it shouldn't be a difficult sale. If you come in with somebody with 500,000 student debt and he's got 100% financing from B of A, it might be a difficult one. And you're usually going to find that the seller has to stay on the lease for a period of time. And, that's where you get into what you can negotiate. And, we have one
it's a whole conversation. Let's go to some of these questions. So here's a question about buying charts from another dentist. So this doctor is saying he's got another dentist. It's a really successful practice. He's thinking about selling charts and equipment and leasehold separately. Then this dentist would be adding patients to the existing office, saving on overhead, gaining efficiencies. How do we value charts? He's read this doctor saying maybe $150 a chart. I have my own opinions. Why don't you go ahead? So you've done chart sales. How do you see those valued?
The values are usually not very high. Usually they are based upon a dollar amount that you assign to it. Now you could have a very unusual practice and that practice could be doing very well. and you're just selling it. But most of them aren't like that. Most of them are practice sales and charts that you're not really doing that well. And, you should just be happy to get out of it at whatever the best price is that you can
Now,
get.
one thing that I've done, Pat, is I will do something, and there's a little risk involved in it, is I'll go to the buyer of the charts and say, okay, you pay me, buyer, 25% of the gross revenues from the patients that we transferred over for the next 3 years. That's 75%, which about equates to what goodwill is. So if I've got, $300,000 in revenues, that would mean that if they collected 300,000 of those patients, they get 75,000 each year for 3 years. That's one way I've seen it done. I don't know what you think about that.
I've seen it done that way too. If you're talking to a struggling seller, struggling person that you want to buy your charts, they may take that thing all day long. If it's a real strong party that you want to sell it to, they typically don't want to do that. So these things are all over the place, and it just depends on who the parties are.
Yeah, then there's the same doctor says collections 800,000, net income 330 for their practice. That's a pretty strong practice. That's about a 40% net.
I think Art would take that listing.
Now, yeah, I'll take the listing. I'm not really sure what the question is. So, doctor, maybe you can phrase your question. Another question we have is this doctor was offered to buy a practice with someone. He wants the buyer to pay 60% of the purchase price, and he will pay 40%. Everything will be split with 50-50 ownership. So this sounds like a partnership. Reasoning is because he knows the seller and there'll be no broker fees. What are your thoughts on this arrangement? So wants me to pay 60% of the purchase price and he'll pay 40%. Not really sure I understand.
New practice they're buying?
It looks like I was offered to buy a practice with someone and he wants me to pay 60% of the price and he will pay 40. So maybe he wants him to buy in 60% and then they'll split it everything 50-50. So it sounds like a partnership buy-in. He knows the seller and there'll be no broker fees. Well, I'd have to really get deeper into that situation, Pat. I'd have to look at the numbers and the reasoning. I'm not sounding, it's kind of hard to evaluate that just on those facts.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
If you're buying into a practice, you only want to be a 50% partner. You never want to be a 40% partner. You don't want the other guy only paying for 40% of it, and yet he's a 50% partner. I don't care if he's known all over the country. It's just not a good idea. You're going to be on unequal footing. That's really all I want.
And Pat, have you and I had conversation where I'm trying to convince you to let my seller be the 51% partner, and what do you tell me?
I say, well, I can't say it in front of all you guys. You can imagine what I
I would imagine. All right, let's move on.
Any more in the Q&A?
Nope, we got it. I think we got all the questions.
Okay, Amanda. Okay, I'll just kind of quickly run through these things. As I said earlier, seller, you're not going to be released from liability. If you're going to go in there and you're going to negotiate the lease anytime soon, maybe you have an extension coming up, that's the time to hire an attorney and go in and start negotiating this stuff out. Landlord permitted to adjust rent to market upon assignment. I'm not seeing this as much as I used to. It used to be really bad. I think maybe they've learned their lesson. I don't know. The rent for the option period may be something where just the landlord decides what it is. I think in most states, at least that I operate in, I think the people that put out the forms have learned their lessons. And when they put these out, they're not as bad as they had been. But if they happen to fall into these things, they're really not something that a buyer should be very happy about. Well, and finally, a consent to an assignment shall be in the landlord's sole discretion. All that means is if they don't like the buyer, or they just want to get back in their own practice that they solved 5 years ago. They can do it. They can say, I'm not accepting you because this is a sole discretion standard, which is the worst standard to have in any contract in the world. Amanda? Some other seller concerns. You're going to be asked in most states to allow the seller's name to be on the door for 1 or 2 years. Depends on the state. Some states don't even have laws on it, but they have customs. If you're going to do it, there is a thing called name on door insurance. It's not something that your average salesman is going to necessarily know about, but if you get them to look into it, they will find name on door insurance. What it means is that while the seller's name is being used in connection with that practice, if there is a lawsuit for work that came up as being deficient after the sale, and the seller had nothing to do with it, then the insurance company will typically provide insurance for the seller since he had nothing to do with it. Completing work can be a problem. I just try to put in a standard as to when it has to be done. Redo work, that's another one where it varies according to what state are you operating in. I generally, and I'm sure I saw Danielle's name out there. If she's still on, I'm sure she does the same thing. And that is we try to have it tied to what our statute of limitations is for malpractice. I think that makes sense that you do it. Not everything is found in that time period, 1 or 2 years, but I'd say 99% of it is found in that time period. The other thing too is that even if they can't sue you for malpractice, they can always sue you and say, I want my money back. So, Amanda? Okay. This is one that came up some years back. We looked at this practice on behalf of a buyer, and we said, this is way over the market. The great thing today is, at least in the large areas, and this happened to be in the, let's just call it the LA area, you can go to Zillow or you can go to one of the other sites, and if there are other dentists in there, you can typically find out what they're charging, and you can typically find out what whether or not this offer that the seller is making to you, because they happen to own the unit, or even like it could just be the landlord is offering this. You could find out, like we did here, that it was significantly above what the market is. We also found in this one that the options were not assignable, which meant there's no lender in the country, unless it had more than 5 years to go, that was going to make it. The options were always going to be the higher of fair market or the rent in the last month. Again, buyer, you will end up unhappy with that. If the whole market does what it did back in 2009 and collapses, and you're paying an amount significantly higher than what your neighbors are paying, you're not going to be happy with that. And we had that in my son and I had that in our own personal case study, where we got out of a lease with the Irvine company and bought a building because we were being asked to pay $350 on the 3rd floor, and the new guys in the 12th floor were paying $220 coming in. And but the Irvine company didn't quite see it.
Pat, can I ask a question about options that are personal to the tenant that can or cannot be assigned? Do we still have those issues?
I thought I said it, and let me say it to be sure. Virtually every one of your leases is going to say, if it's an AIR form, it's going to be in the back, like paragraph 39. Most of them are going to say that the options are going to be personal to the person signing it, not the subsequent tenant. So it's something you really need to look at before you sell it. I know I do this with a lot of the brokers. I'll say, before we get too into it, could I see it? And let me just see if we have these landlord issues, because if we do, probably need to deal with them right now. In this particular one, we managed to work this thing out. It wasn't a big deal because it worked out. If it hadn't worked out, we weren't going to be real happy about it. So Amanda, next. I just throw this one out because it's not really a good example of anything other than landlords being pigs. This gentleman, his name is Jacob. Jacob was really an amazing guy. He still is. He's 90. He's gonna be 97 soon.
Well, he was a Holocaust survivor because I know him.
He was a Holocaust survivor, and
yeah, amazing man.
He was so worried that he was going to be on the hook for the subsequent 2 5-year extensions. He had me fight them tooth and nail to try to get them out of keeping him on the hook. If I said, Jacob, let's get real here. How long do you think you're going to be here? And he wasn't offended, but he was, you never know, I might be here until I'm 110, 112. And so, unfortunately, we were not able to get him out of that one, but it's funny that those things
he came to my dental marketing live seminar when he was 91. So he was marketing his practice when he was 91. Amazing.
Yeah, and our friend Kathleen loved him too.
Yep.
Yeah. So Amanda.
Oh yeah.
So when do you tell the staff you're selling? Okay, I know what the brokers say. You never tell them until not only is the purchase agreement signed, but the loan has been approved and the landlord has signed off on the contract saying you can actually assign it to the new buyer. That's how a lot of the brokers like to operate. I did something on Dental Town. I'm sure some of you are Dental Town people. Somebody asked me, when should you tell them? And I said, you really shouldn't tell the staff until you get loan approval. Man, I got like 9 hate mails as a result of that, saying I was an idiot for all kinds of reasons. And what I realized is that you're probably best if, and I don't know how you do this, but if you can follow whether or not the staff has figured out that you're selling the practice, once you know that, at least tell your key person what you're doing and why you're doing it. And while you're telling them that, make sure you let them know how the practice is selling for this price because of everything you, the staff, have done. I mean, they really need to hear this kind of stuff. And we probably don't do it enough with our own staffs and let them know how important they are. But if you find yourself in this situation, I think it's better to let them know sooner rather than later, no matter what the brokers say out there.
Oh, okay. And Pat, it's interesting. Many of the sellers will tell us categorically they are not telling the staff until the money for the whole sale is in the bank account. And that was the last 3 sales I closed in the middle of a pandemic in December. And they all worked out fine. Dr. Potter and I always like about a week before, you gotta make sure the sales, the purchase and sale agreement is signed and the lease is signed. The problem is that there's usually only a $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 deposit. So if when they meet the dental team and something goes wrong, it could blow the thing up. So yeah, I mean, there's different schools of thought about this. The safest way for the seller is not until the money's in the bank, but then, if it's a good practice and the seller is a good person, and they're going to make the transition good. That has worked out many times.
Now, you've just heard Art Wiederman tell you that he and his partner, Dr. Potter, like to wait until everything is basically sealed and delivered. Now, I will tell you, I represented Dr. Potter years ago, and Dr. Potter sold his practice. And we didn't have an agreement. We had a letter of intent. And I called him and I said, and I noticed there's stuff in the background. I said, where are you? Well, he told me we're at the ski resort. And I said, who are you with? Oh, I got my buyer here with me and his wife. And I said, but you haven't signed anything. You don't know if the buyer's going to do this. Oh, I have faith in the guy. It worked out.
Yeah, it did that, but that's Phil. So everybody is different. Some people are nervous. So it's every situation is different. And I, as a broker, take into account, what the seller, because I work for the seller. One thing, guys, you do need to know is that in California, brokers are allowed to be what's called dual agents. And what that means is they can legally, in California, as a real estate agent or broker, represent both the buyer and the seller. And I don't do that. I only represent the seller because that's who's paying my bill, and that's who I have a fiduciary responsibility to. So, I have a responsibility. If this is what my seller wants, I'm not going to fight with him or her. So
no, you can't. Right? He's your client. You got to do what your client tells you.
exactly.
Yeah. Amanda, next. Okay, you get this a lot. Can I work back? Well, a short and simple answer is if you're not doing $1.3 million, not even $1 million, $1.3 million, probably makes no sense to expect that you can work back. Now, having said that, can you work back 1 day a week? Yeah, probably. You can do that. But if you expect to have a job, it's probably not going to work unless you have a $2 million practice. And so be aware of that, sellers out there. There's probably not going to be a place for you unless you have a really big practice. Then it might work out.
Yeah,
Okay,
1.3, Pat. I've run the numbers 20 ways to Sunday, and that's about because you got to have enough money. You got to have enough money to be able to. The buyer's got to be able to pay you as an associate, pay the bank loan, and pay their personal expenses. And 1.3 is about the minimum. That's about right.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. Amanda? Okay, now we move into the section of who your lender's going to be, buyers. But let me say something before that. A lot of people like to sell their own practice. They generally are going to find out it's a lot harder to sell your practice than you thought it was. And so you may just want to give the broker 9 or 10%, maybe less if you can get it, and let them handle it and let them show it on the weekends and other times. But we do have people that try to sell these things on their own. Probably the best advice I can give them is make sure at the outset, if you have a buyer, you know who the buyer is. You get a lot of looky-loos out here. They'll look at practices and think somebody's going to bail me out, even while my credit rating is a 500 FICO. And so I just tell them, make sure you get them to actually pull one of these credit reports because they're free once a year, and make sure you know who it is. And if they're way off the pattern, or you just don't want to work with them, in my opinion.
Pat, let me jump in on one thing. One of the things that we do as brokers, we learned this early in the game. We will not put any buyer into a letter of intent, which ties the practice up, until they have vetted their financing. That either means that they're going to be a cash buyer, they've got to show me a bank account or a brokerage account with 800,000 in it, if that's the price, or we send them to the bank. Oh, I want this practice. Oh, I'm good. I've been pre-approved. Well, you've been pre-approved to buy a practice that does about this, but we got to look at the practice. So we will not, because for the sellers, if I put somebody into contract and they haven't been approved, the banks, they're all our friends, Pat. We know all the bankers, they're all our friends. But right now with COVID and everything going on, it's taking 2 weeks, 3 weeks sometimes to underwrite, maybe longer. What if somebody comes along a week into the process and you're in contract and they say, oh my God, this is the practice of my dreams. I'm ready. Mom and dad are going to write a check for 800,000. I want to buy it in 30 days. And you're still in contract with someone who hasn't even been approved for a loan. So that's why we encourage every single buyer, every single seller to not go into contract until that buyer has shown that they can buy the practice. They've been fully approved by the bank, and the bank says, here is the commitment letter. We are loaning you 800,000 on this practice.
Yeah, and you raise I think, a very good point, and that is, Don't accept a buyer who says, I've been pre-approved.
No.
Because they don't know what that means. Pre-approval means it's two things. One, we look at your credit and we determine that you're not a complete bum, if you will. And so they're saying that, yeah, I think you can probably, do this. The other one, though, is they have to match you up with the practice. And if you're trying to go into somewhere where, they're doing high-end stuff and you're doing low-end work, you're not going to get approved by these guys. So pre-approval letters are not really pre-approval until they match it to the practice.
And be aware, folks, that in April, in our 4th series, we're going to be having the folks from Bank of America talk about what is their underwriting process like? What are they looking for in a buyer? What are they looking for in a seller's numbers? So we're going to cover all of that over the next several months in these webinars.
So, doctors, if you're out there and you have somebody that comes in and says, hey, and I had this last month, somebody said, oh yeah, I've got all this money, not a problem. It's I think it was let's just say it was a bank in the Mideast area of the world, and they said they'd do it. Well, after 4 months, we never got the money. And, I told my client, this is about his 3rd time, I said, this is not the person that you wanted to deal with. The person you want to deal with is somebody that makes these loans on a regular basis. They give personalized service. They are able to analyze exactly what the buyer does and the seller does and whether or not you're going to be a good fit. They're interested that the buyer is going to be successful. They don't want a buyer who's going to fail. It's like the worst thing that can happen to a B of A or Lindever or whoever you might want to point a finger at. They don't want to see that these things are going to fail. And so they're going to look at it pretty hard. And that's really what you as a seller want and you as a buyer. Amanda? So let's talk about some red flags that are going to prevent your buyer from being approved. First one I'd already mentioned, if they have a low credit score, which generally, according to people like Dina Cola and others, it's 680, it's under 680. He's not happy about that, so Bank of America is not going to loan on that. If you're a buyer, you ought to be checking your own credit. You don't want to walk in there and find out somebody's put you in default, taking a default judgment. This happened to me years ago. He had no idea about it. And because of that default, he had something in the 5s and couldn't qualify for anything. And he had no idea about it. One thing that Justin Klingerhorn from B of A is going to talk about is if you have very high living expenses, if you have high credit card expenses, if you've been in bankruptcy in the past, if you owe a bunch of money to the government, you're not usually going to look real good to a lender, and the lender is going to have a hard time doing this. Now, there are a lot of ways around this, just like everything else in the world. You could be married to a woman who is making $1 million a year as a plastic surgeon and doesn't have any of these problems. They're going to probably approve you in a heartbeat as long as she signs off on it. I mean, there are always exceptions to these. We're talking in general about what really happens out there to the typical buyer. But there are always going to be people that aren't going to have these problems. And so, we're not saying this is absolute, but we're saying these are general guidelines.
It would be a good idea, folks, for the buyers like Pat was talking about when we talked about pre-approval. While a seller should never take a buyer who says he or she has been pre-approved, a buyer should go, and all the banks, we know all the bankers, they're all really good people. Everybody rents money for about the same price, give or take 25, 50 basis points. The bottom line is, for a buyer, you should go to one of these lenders and basically sit down and call them up, and Pat and I know them all, and say, hey, I want to buy a practice in the next 1 to 2 years. I want to buy a practice that's doing 800,000. They'll pull your credit. They'll look at your credit score. They'll sit down and they'll say, doctor, you know what? You've got lates on your home mortgage payment. That is the kiss of death. If you have a late on your home mortgage payment, they're going to say, you need to fix A, B, and C before you go, because you don't want to go find the practice of your dreams, buyer, doctor, and come to find out that nobody's going to loan you money for less than 15% annually. And there are lenders that will lend you money at much higher rates, but right now the rates are in the low threes, sometimes in the twos, in some cases, mostly in the low to mid threes. So interest rates are as good as they've been, but you got to make sure before you start looking for a practice, go to one of the lenders, let them run your credit, let them look at the credit score with you, and they will tell you where your problems are.
I will say this. I think, we're aware of this. You may have a bad score. You may have bad things that have happened in your life credit-wise. It doesn't mean you're not going to get somebody to make you a loan. We happen to know of 3 different lenders in the country that will come in and make that loan. But while it may be at 3%, they may want 5.5 or 6%. They may want money down. So there may be a way around it, but it's usually not going to work out very well. So if you're a seller, you probably don't want to work with that person. Amanda? I mentioned the skill set. If it's not the same for both, it could be a real problem. If you got somebody who's just buying practices, we have people who do that. Just like we have people who buy real estate and they run around and they buy it. That's okay if it's real estate, but if it's something you're working, it's probably not a good idea. It's probably not something that the lender is going to be happy about loaning on. If you're buying it as a so-called investment, that's a real red flag. They are not going to want to make that loan to you. Amanda? Now, I know Justin at B of A might disagree with this, but I always think if a lender questions something, you ought to be questioning it. If the lender is having a problem with something, they're all making 100% loans, okay? So if you're going and you're doing this, and the lender has a problem with it, you might want to look at it with whoever's your counselor on this and see if it's going to be a problem for you. If you have declining revenue figures, COVID is an exception, okay? I think the lenders have all agreed that, we're going to just reset the clock. We're going to start looking at August. But generally, if there's not some pandemic going on and they see that the loans, that the amount of money that the seller is taking in is going down, that's going to be a problem.
Pat, we had a question on that. We got several questions, which we can get to in a little bit here. But one of the questions was, how is the pandemic affecting the valuation? So I'll let you give yours. I'll give mine.
Well, we had a conference call back in August, and with one of the biggest lender out there, B of A, and Joe, who runs it. He's basically said, we're going to look at this as if it's starting anew. We're not going to look back in time, but we're probably not going to approve a lot of loans until near the end of the year or starting next year, which is kind of what did happen, by the way, because they wanted to see that it got back to where it was. I do think it has affected the value of the practices, because if you don't know for sure that you're going to be able to get back to that, particularly if the seller doctor is retiring and not going to be part of it, then it's going to raise questions in the eyes of the lender as to whether or not it can sustain itself. Art?
So I will tell you that when the pandemic hit in the middle of March, what happened was that practice sale activity died. It stopped completely. And it stopped pretty much, Pat, till June or July. And then dental offices in this country and in California opened up anywhere between the middle of May and the middle of June, depending on what you decided. Yeah. And then they started to pick up. And what was happening as we went along is the lenders were saying, okay, we need you, seller, to show, we're not going to make a loan on this practice unless you show us that in the first 1, 2, or 3 months that you reopened, that you were doing at least, some of them were at 80, many of them were at 90% of what you were doing before the pandemic. So if I was doing 100,000 a month in January and February, and then I reopened in June, July, they wanted to see $80,000 to $90,000 in production. They understood it wasn't collections because that had to catch up with itself. I will tell you that the values of practices, they're down a little bit, but we've sold several practices in the last quarter of 2020. I never in my wildest dreams thought we'd sell really good quality practices in the middle of a pandemic. They sold for pretty darn close to what market value was. And I think that they're back. The banks realize that they can't loan based on a 2020 tax return. So I think that the sellers are going to be looking at getting the value, but they're going to have to show that their practices come back at or near where it was before the pandemic. And they're going to have to show the buyers that too. That's kind of my observation.
I agree. Good point. The last thing I wanted to mention on this one is that if you have an associate that's working there, particularly if they're doing a large portion of what is being produced and they don't want to buy the practice, red flag. You want to know why they don't want to do it. I can give you a lot of horror stories on what they did. Sometimes the associate was acquiring and building out a practice in the same building. Wasn't under although most states do acknowledge that covenants not to compete are enforceable, we're in one of those really strange states where we don't agree that associates should be bound by that. So you got to be careful in California what you're doing there. And if they didn't want to buy it, they probably know something, and they may have a reason why they didn't want to buy it that may affect why you don't want to buy it. So, Amanda? Amanda, okay. Yeah, if you've got a practice, and I had one in, in Las Vegas where they had a lot of specialists in there, and the specialists were doing most of the billing. They would not sign an associate agreement. We didn't understand why. We thought, you're making a lot of money here. You should sign this thing. They wouldn't do it. We had a consultant come in and demand it. They said, no, we're not going to do it. Unfortunately, the person that bought it, somewhat older guys, maybe 50. He was only 3-4 years out of school because he'd been an engineer before that. Saw all these other things. Staff turnover is high, high revenues, low number of active patients. Make a long story short, and thank God the seller had to carry a lot of the paper. The specialist left, and the revenue dropped tremendously. And we went back to the seller and we said, we got to cut a deal here. And we did, but again, you don't want to be the person that is having these problems. It's not good to have this happen. Now, Art, I see we have 11 possibly.
Well, we've gotten to some of them. Let's get to a couple of them. One of our doctors is asking to talk about a deal where the seller associates back and the buyer pays the seller a percentage of collections over a number of years in lieu of upfront money. So if I'm the buyer, I'm loving that. But if you're representing the seller, Pat, you're not going to be real thrilled about that, right? With the seller not getting any upfront money. And what if the buyer runs the practice into the ground?
Art, is this something happening or just happened in Torrance, California?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. Hey, listen. So the
And
fact of the matter is, if you're a seller, we don't recommend carrying a whole bunch of money because, again, there's no guarantee that your buyer isn't going to do. I mean, I had a practice that sold in Fresno. It took me forever. It was a 35-year accounting client, and he trusted me to do this. And we found a buyer, and I did something I will never do again. I drove to and from Fresno from Laguna Beach in one day. I will never do that again. And this buyer made every single mistake that you could ever do. Fired the entire dental team within a month. Started talking disrespectfully to patients. And so, you know, we got all the money up front, thank goodness. So if you're a seller, you know, and the buyer is going to carry all the, and you're going to carry all the paper, you're taking a risk. If I'm a buyer, I'm loving that deal, right, Pat?
Absolutely.
I have no risk. I have no risk. You know, if the thing doesn't collect, then I don't have to pay, right?
And unfortunately, in the case that Art is referring to, I represented the seller.
Yep.
I told him, you're out of your mind. Don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. Today, I got a phone call from his attorney, a good friend of ours. And he said, how did that happen? I said, well, client wouldn't listen to me. And, you know, he just closed, I think. Now that attorney wants to throw some things in, but, you know, I guess the thing I'd say is, you know, if you hire somebody to do something for you, follow their advice, you know, or at least weigh it against other things. Don't hire somebody and then, you know, don't listen to what they're telling you. And that's what was going on there.
So Pat, then we have a comment about lenders are unlikely to loan before August of 2021. No, that's not true at all. I mean, lenders are loaning. I talked to one bank today that's going to limit, you know, they're one of the more liberal lenders out there. They're going to go up to 80% of gross, but they've got another product that can bring it up to higher. The other banks are definitely lending. So the money is out there. So you don't have to worry. If you want to buy a practice, there is money to buy a practice out there. Absolutely. Let's see. For a couple of you have put out significant information on your individual situations. I think that what we need to do is maybe give Pat or I a call in our offices, and we'll be happy to talk about it. I want to just answer some general questions as we go, because we won't be able to get through all the material.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me see if there's one. I think there was one more. One of our participants was asking about typical attorney's fees, and we don't quote fees on these webinars because it'd be like me calling a dental office and saying, okay, how much to fix my teeth? Well, it's an average. We don't know. So until we see the transaction, doctor, if you have a question, maybe give Pat a call, talk about the situation, see what we're talking about. And then wouldn't the seller want to spread out the tax burden by accepting a salary? No, we advise the seller not to do anything like that. We want the seller to get cashed out or get a significant cash inflow right now. That does affect the tax burden, but you know, there's no tax burden if you don't get the payments, right?
Yeah. That's one way to look at it.
That is. Okay. All right. Why don't you go back? I want to make sure you get through all the material, Pat.
Okay. And thank you, Amanda, for getting me back on point here. 37, I think we're at. You know, buyer issues, do your due diligence, get help from people like Art and me and other people, because if you're not using people that really know what they're doing, if they're people that don't really do this, but they're trying to help you out, they're probably not going to know what the rules are. I closed the deal last week with somebody that the attorney for the seller had no idea what he was doing. And, you know, it's not my job to try to tell him you screwed up here. Next panel. So goodwill, as you know, is just simply, are the patients going to continue in the practice after the seller leaves? Generally, we know that 80%, maybe more, are going to stay with the practice. How do you protect this? It depends on the kind of goodwill that you have. Obviously, fee for service is great. You may want to, particularly if it's a large enough practice, you may want the seller to stay for some period of time on a part-time basis, so that the patients will see that there's a continuity there. I think it helps. I don't think you need to do it most of the time, but sometimes you ought to. There is an issue about insurance plans. And, you know, I can't really tell you that there's a way that every insurance company is going to look at this, but I can tell you that many of the heads of these companies have told me, we don't really care for the first 90 days what's happening, you know, whether or not the seller is working back for the buyer or the seller's not even there. We just want our patients to be seen by somebody. And so they're not, you know, unless you bring somebody in and you just disappear to another country, they're not going to be terribly concerned for a short period of time. Now, if you don't convert them over in a period of time that makes sense, that's going to be a problem, and you're probably going to get dropped from that. Amanda, 39. Associate Dennis. Let me just tell you this case in Long Island, only because my wife and her brothers owned the building in Amityville, and there was a.
So are you saying this is the Amityville horror story you're about to tell? Is that the deal?
Well, you know, it's they were 3 blocks from that horrible house.
That was my futile attempt at accountant and broker humor. Go ahead.
No, that's where I used to take my son Jason when I wanted to scare him. I'd say, Jason, I'm going to drop you off here unless you start acting better. And that's why he's a good dental attorney today.
That's right. And he is a very good dental attorney.
Yes. So in this case, unbeknownst to the seller, the buyer was actually was building out a practice across the street that nobody really knew about. And we tried to get him to sign something saying he was going to stay. He said no, he wouldn't do that. I told my guy, it's not a good sign. You probably don't want to do this. And unfortunately, he did it. And he essentially stole at least half of the patients. So it's, you know, if you're a seller or you're even a buyer, you want to make sure you know what's going on. Next panel. In California, you have 2 types of employees. You have the salaried employee and the at-will employment. I don't think they're really terribly important here. I would say, you know, if we had a little more time, let's go into it. So let's go to 42. Here's some horrible cases. And Art, you might know some of these brokers. Well, at least the first one is somebody in California. He convinced the seller that he would not take any changes whatsoever to the purchase agreement. It was not a great purchase agreement, and my guy did back out. And then, of course, it turned out that the seller was being audited, and the seller went to jail and is now serving time. It was, you know, we were just trying to get certain representations and they would not do it.
So Pat, can we chat for a second since we're talking about changing purchase agreements? Many of the brokers out there, I am not one of them, provide a purchase and sales document. Okay, now I am not a licensed attorney. I don't even play one on TV. To me, is that an issue? Do you run into issues with documents or, you know, the seller says, you know, my buddy down the street sold a practice, and let's just use his document or her document. But you know, when a broker provides a document, How does that work with you as the attorney?
Well, first off, you don't want to use somebody else's document from another deal. It's just too hard to change all the information. But if a broker, reputable broker, comes up with a practice sales agreement, I at least am generally going to work with them and try to make it into a better one.
Okay.
You know, you got to remember that the broker's job, brokers aren't all evil people. What they're trying to do is bring the parties together. So most of them are not going to have a problem. Now, if they have a problem with anybody changing it, then you probably have a problem, buyer and or seller. So that's where I'd be concerned about. But I would say that the majority of them are going to go along with changes if they're reasonable.
Okay.
So next one. If you're buying into a specialty practice, I'm just going to say you have to keep the person on for a period of time, generally 6 to 12 months, because you want to make sure that the people are coming to you. And if you're the referring general dentist and you know that the specialist is gone, you're probably going to look for somebody else. So you want to keep them there for a period of time. Now, I want to talk about something that is not, it's
politically correct.
It's not politically correct, and it has been a problem at times. I'll just give you the one example. I had this very sweet buyer who just had to have a practice in Chinatown in San Fran. And problem was she was not only Persian, but that was her first language. So I asked the broker, I said, so who's the seller? And the seller was a person that his first language was Chinese. And I said, well, can I get a patient list? Got the patient list. I'd say 80%, if not more, were Chinese or, some form of Taiwanese. And I said, you're really not going to be able to convert these people over because they're used to going to this person who shares the same background, the same thought process, the same language. It's really not a good deal. She did back out. She did buy another one, and it worked out. You do run into this problem where you try to look at where the patients are coming from. There are certain religions that are very, very loyal to the doctor. It's based upon whatever their background is, and it doesn't matter what it is. If they happen to fall into one of those categories, that could be a problem. And so I try to snoop around and find out who they are and whether there are any of these issues and where the referrals are coming from. And if I see they're all 40, 50, 60% are coming from one church, then I know we have a problem, and it might be a good idea to move on to another practice. Yeah. Amanda, next. We were going to talk about this, and it kind of came up earlier. In California, the covenant not to compete, it's fully enforceable in connection with the sale of a practice. It's got to be reasonable. Same thing with the covenant not to solicit, particularly when you're talking about one dentist referring to another dentist. The covenant not to treat people, again, I try to tie these to the 3 or 5 years, depending on what state I'm operating in. There are even some that do 2 years. And the same thing with the covenant not to hire. Now, I can talk about this to any of you if you want to give me a call. But just know that even California does recognize that these things have to be enforceable. Amanda, next. I don't want to toot the horn of any of the dental attorneys versus the non-dental attorneys, but the last thing you want is to bring somebody into your deal who's a litigator And, I was a litigator early in my career, 40 years ago. And, I couldn't answer a question without asking a question, because that's what you're taught in law school. And so I wasn't a very good transactional attorney initially. Using a family member or a friend of yours, unless they have a background in the dental world, how are they going to know if they're properly advising you? We have specialties, like Art has a specialty in the world of dental CPAs. You can try to ask around in the industry. The problem is sometimes you ask the wrong person, and that person, particularly if you've been around for 35 years, may have remembered something from 20 years ago, and they don't like that person. So be careful. You're probably better off asking the dental CPAs and the lenders and people like that, who should be a little fairer as how they are viewing people. Amanda? Okay, we're getting to Art territory here. Okay. If you own a practice, you need to know your lease. We talked about virtually all these things earlier. Beware of somebody who tells you it's a standard lease and you don't have to worry about the standard lease because everybody signs it. Well, these are all written by the attorney for the landlord. They are not going to be standard, at least when it comes to protecting the buyer. So do spend the time, even if it's, there are some good brokers that do understand the dental world. They understand that you're putting in hundreds of thousands of dollars into the location and that you don't want to be kicked out or have somebody else kicked out. Not everybody gets that. Most of the world doesn't operate that way, but be aware that's a real thing. A new lease versus assuming an existing lease. I would just say this. If you have something that's coming due in the next 6 months and you're not going to have a significant or even any increase in what the lease rate is, you can probably enter into a new lease. But if they're trying to force you into paying more money, they're trying to force you into changing from a gross lease to a triple net. And again, I can talk to you guys about it, but there's major difference here. You don't want these people to hoodwink you and get you to go along with these things. You really want to have somebody advising you on should I or should I not do this. Amanda? We said this early on, options being personal to you. They're in everybody's contract. You're going to stay on the lease forever and ever. Also, you really need to have somebody, sellers, to look at this stuff so this doesn't become a problem for you. Next one, Amanda. I can't wait to get to I think it's the next one. Assignment and subletting language, where it becomes a problem. If they can get, the landlord can get a percentage of what you get from the sale, that's a bad deal, okay? Because you're the one taking the risk. You're building up the practice at this location. Why should the landlord have anything to do with it? We'll talk about a case that's directly on point with that. Another one is the recapture clause. And, again, these are things you should have an attorney looking at before you even list these things for sale. Because if they are problems, deal with them now before they know that you're trying to sell the practice. Because you're a known quantity. The next person is not going to be a known quantity. Try to get them to do it now. We talked about personal options. Let's go to the next one, Amanda. Well, I can just say this is true. And I will tell you, I have a friend. He's been a friend for 35, 40 years, very wealthy man. He and I were rookies together way back when, and he got into the landlord game, and he owns regional malls all over the country. Well, at least all over the southwest, the western part of the country. He went to a class one time, And I said, so what'd you learn, Jeff? I know you guys are probably not learning. You're probably fooling around. He said, oh, no, there's a class you could have taught. I said, what's it about? He says, it's how to take advantage of the tenant, particularly if the tenant has put a lot of money into the location, you know, like a restaurant or a dental practice or something like that. So know that these guys are on to how to take advantage of you. The bigger they are, probably the tougher they're going to be. But I try to get these issues out early rather than later so that you know exactly where you're at. And now let's talk about how they do this. Next panel, Amanda. This is a case. It involved a dear friend of Art's and mine, a guy named
Yes.
Bob Best.
Very
His
good.
company, West Star. Yes. And in this case, he had the tenant sign something saying that 3/4 of the sale price from the sale of the practice, this is a long ago case, 35 years ago, he was going to get 3/4 of whatever the sale price was. The tenant said, I'm not going to let you do that. I'm going to fight you. And Amanda, next panel. Amanda. Okay, let's see if I can do this. Okay.
You did it all by, yeah, there we go. Okay.
Did I know Bob Best?
I don't know.
what you're going to say. What the court held in this one is that the tenant built up all the value here. The landlord couldn't claim any value of the business because they had nothing to do with it. It's California state. So if you're picking up on this and you're in Florida, know that the law is not that way there. It just varies according to how you do it. Now, this guy, Bob Best, I will tell you why Art loves him on the next panel. Amanda.
Oh, yeah.
So Art was the broker on this.
Art was.
I thought he was, yes. I thought he did a great job. He got a nice purchase price based on pretty good collections. The seller was a wonderful guy. We had a great bottle of, what was it, Opus One at a restaurant when he closed.
We did.
The problem was it took like 8 months to close. And that was because of a fellow named Bob. So,
yeah, hey,
Mike,
Pat, can I jump in here for a second?
Yeah.
This doctor became a client of mine, accounting client, when he opened his practice probably 20 years ago. And I remember this. I begged him, please, you need to spend some money with an attorney looking at this lease they want you to sign. And he gave us the standard, well, I don't have the money to do that, and it's a standard lease, and the guy said it was okay. All right, now continue with the story.
So I get involved in the thing, and I guess he's finally listening to Art's advice. The buyer had loan approval for $1 million. They had $200,000 being offered in cash. The lease had 1.5 years to go, 2 5-year options, all looked good. Landlord consented to the assignment. Generally, they have to do that. But he had an options personal language in it, and it basically said they're not assignable to you. And our friend Bob, who I found out a lot about him later at a seminar, all I knew is that he was not being very nice because he wanted $100,000 from what our client was getting in order to allow an assignment of the lease. And on top of that, I think the lease rate was maybe at 275. Well, he talked them into going to 4.25, which I thought.
Now, this is about 10, 12 years ago. Just set the table.
So probably 6 now.
Yeah.
And I will say there was somebody from one of the big companies who was the boyfriend of the woman buying it. And he talked her into it and said, don't listen to him. I'll make a long story short. They finally did take $50,000 only because I begged them and begged them and begged them. And within a year, it had gone under.
Yeah, and Pat, I personally delivered the check to the landlord, and I looked and I talked to your friend Bob's number 2 guy, because I didn't get to meet Bob. And I looked him in the eye and I said, may I say something that may or may not offend you? I said, you guys are evil. I said it to his face. And he just smiled at me.
Yeah.
I will never forget that. I personally, as the broker, delivered the $50,000 check because we had to get it done that way.
I mean, it's
It was
unbelievable.
horrible.
But they can get away with it, and they do. And you know, Bob is probably one of the primary examples of the bad guys, but there are other ones. Next one, Amanda.
Yeah, so Pat, we're getting close to 8 o'clock, so I've got a couple more questions I want to hit at you.
Okay.
Maybe if we go 5 or 10 minutes over, I don't want to go much longer than that. I want to respect.
You want to take them now?
What?
You want to take the questions right now?
Sure. We have a couple of general questions that are actually really good. How long should a seller remain to help with the transition?
Well, I mean, I'm sure we both have different thoughts, or probably the same thought. If it's a specialty practice, you must stay there for as long as you can get the seller to stay there.
At least 6 months is, in my opinion, for a specialty.
At least, yeah. I mean, it just depends on the size of the practice. If it's go ahead.
Now, I was going to say, normally in a general practice, what we do is we have the buyer acting as kind of the greeter, the seller acting as the greeter for about the first week. They finish their cases out. And usually after a week, maybe 2 at the most, buyer says, I'm good, because the letter's gone out and, you know, the patients are called. There's a whole, buyers, you should hire a dental consultant to come in and facilitate the verbal skills of the transition. So we can talk about that another time. So then I've got, so I think, you know, during a general, doesn't have to be very long. Got a couple other really good questions, Pat, I want to touch on is, let's see, where is this? I thought I saw a couple more, maybe it was in the chat. Hold on, yeah. Oh, when selling your practice and you own a freestanding building, is it better to sell together or keep the building for passive rental income? I think it's better to keep it as an investment and give the buyer a first option to buy it down the road. Pat, what do you think?
No, I agree with you. And particularly if it's an appreciating building. Now you have to look at cases where if the seller is 70 years old and needs the money, he's not going to want to do that. I mean, every case is going to be different, but generally, if the guy has enough money to live on, it's probably a pretty good idea to hold on to the building as long as you can and give the buyer an option. But make it an option. Don't make it something where the buyer has the absolute right to acquire the building whenever the buyer wants to, because the CPAs like Art are going to tell you you're an idiot to do that.
I will never tell any of these nice people that they're idiots, Pat. I will not do that. Okay, one more question, and then let's wrap this thing up. So practice has a lot of small patients, small credit balances, but because there's so many, they add up to a big amount of 50,000. What do you do with credit balances? Here's what I want to do with a credit balance. So what I don't want to do, buyer, is I don't want seller to send a check back to the patient for the $3, $8, $10, because that patient is also going to get a letter that says the practice is sold. And then they get their credit balance back and they go, well, wait a minute, this office must be going out of business, closing their doors. I'm going to go find another dentist. What I recommend that you do, folks, on a credit balances is that if there's credit balances, the seller on closing as part of the prorations, and we can do this through escrow if you want, writes a check to the buyer for whatever the credit balances are. So then when the buyer takes over the practice, the buyer, Mrs. Smith comes in to Dr. Wiederman. Now, Mrs. Smith, I want to let you know that, you've still got a credit of, $200 on your account for the first cleaning that we're going to do. And then the patient says, oh, that's great, wonderful, as opposed to that patient getting a check and then saying, maybe I should go find another dentist. That's my opinion.
I put that into every one of my agreements when I represent the buyer. I believe that you're telling the patients that the seller has left, not a good idea. B, it's usually not a lot of money, and so you can do it. and see, even if it is a fair amount of money, gives the buyer some work to do. Now, this doesn't work in every state. I will tell you, there are states where you absolutely have to give the money back to them at the time of sale. I would say it's not that many, but you have to. And so you have to talk to an attorney about whether you have to do that or not. But most of the time, what Art said, I totally agree with it. Certainly in California.
So Pat, how much more stuff you got? Because we're right at 8 o'clock, and again, I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. Let's hit some high notes, and then we'll let everybody go home. Oh, well, they already are home. So
I just wanted to summarize the buyer issues. Okay.
Go ahead.
Make sure, and Amanda, if you want to drop it, make sure that you find somebody who the buyer's using who's dental specific. Buyer, make sure you do your due diligence. Hire somebody to come in and look at where the patients are coming from, how many new ones you're getting a month, what they're doing. Have somebody thoroughly review the lease, make sure you don't have a problem, and spend the money and hire somebody to look at this stuff, because it's not going to hurt you now, but it could hurt you later, buyer.
Buyers, you're gonna hire a CPA to do accountant's due diligence. You're gonna hire a dental management consultant to do management due diligence. I'm going to be talking about accountant's due diligence next month, and Kathleen will be talking about management due diligence.
Yeah. And then finally, and I'm not even going to talk about Delta because it's not as much of a problem now as it had been. Sellers, review your lease today, this weekend. I mean, make sure you know what's in there. Have somebody look at it for you. I'm happy to do that. Just make sure you're not going to have a problem that's going to come back later and kill your sale. Art will tell you, if you've been writing off all your trips to Costco and or other parties that are not legitimate expenses, you probably want to stop it sooner rather than later. You want to get 2, 3, 4 years where you're totally clean according to anybody who's going to look at it, because this is just going to boost the value of it. Consult with your CPA on the transition timing, what your taxes are going to be. Make sure you know what they're going to be. Of course, you want to make sure the sales price is right. When somebody calls me and says, we're not using an attorney, we're just going to establish what the value is ourselves, it depends on whether they're the buyer or the seller. If it's a buyer, he's usually going to way undervalue. If it's the seller, he's going to grossly exceed what the market is. And then finally, just screen the people that you're going to hire and make sure they know what they're doing. And don't go for the bargain basement people out there, whether they're attorneys or CPAs, whatever they might be, that say, I'll do it. Because I will tell you, at least in California, most of the low-cost people are not real good about this stuff. And they may now know what they're doing, but they're not going to put a lot of time into it because they're not charging you very much. So that's it.
Here's one more question. And if a buyer and seller are very comfortable in a buy-sell, could you use one broker or attorney? You address the attorney, I'll address the broker.
I will say there are people out there as attorneys that try to do that. I know that there are CPAs that try to do that, but you have to look at what are the conflicts, and the conflicts, at least from my perspective, the conflicts can be enormous. And under our state bar code, every time any conflict comes up, you have to go to the client who's affected and get them to sign off on each and every one of those. It's insane to do it. It's impossible to really do it. I imagine it's pretty similar for you, Art.
Yeah, I would never, ever represent both sides in a transaction. We have to do conflict letters, and I would just not do it. As far as brokers go, remember, there's only going to be one broker in a dental practice sale. It's not like real estate. So there's going to be one broker. That broker is, if it's me, it's an agent for the seller. So the buyer, you need to get a management team. If it's a broker for both sides, buyer, you need to get a management team, because remember, who is paying the broker? It's not the buyer, it's the seller. Okay, so that's what they're going to do. So you need buyer, you need your own independent team. You don't need a broker, but you need an attorney, a CPA, a dental consultant, and someone to inspect the equipment, and a banker to all look at this. So,
Yep.
all right, Counselor, we're about, I'm sorry to do this to you, but we're a little over 8 o'clock. Amanda, can you go back up to the top and put up our names and contact information again? So folks, Pat, any final comments you want to make about this?
Well, I just simply, I mean, as you can tell, it's fairly complex. And you'll have people who may tell you it's not complex, but I can tell you from doing this for all these years, make sure you have somebody on your side who understands what they're looking at, not somebody who's a newbie. And make sure that you identify what the issues are. If you do that, doesn't matter who you use, just make sure they know what they're doing. It's going to help you in the long run. And you do see my info there, Pat at Dental Attorneys. There's an 800 number. So feel free to call me and feel free to call Mr. Wiederman.
Yeah, and so folks, I want to thank you all for attending. This is the first of 4 webinars. So the next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, February 17th at the same time, 6 to 8. I will be the presenter. I'm going to talk about a little financial planning, valuation, what buyers are looking for and should be looking for, what sellers should be looking for, tax ramifications, partnerships. So I'm going to get into some of the numbers and stuff about that. Also, be sure if you can make it the week before, which is February the 10th. We have Christy Bolts in our Business for Dentistry, our year-long session with all the 6 dental societies. She is dynamite when she talks about dental marketing. So, Counselor Pat, thank you so much for your great, wise counsel and your great information to all the attendees. I hope attendees that it was of help to you. We got to most all of the questions. If you have individual questions about your situations on any of these webinars, it's best to call the professional and talk to them. So you might give Pat or give me a call. Amanda, thank you so much for all your help. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda.
Guys, it was great.
Okay. Counselor, thank you very much. Dental Society members and attendees, thank you for attending. And again, if you're a new dentist, we're doing a new dentist webinar next Tuesday night between 6 and 8 p.m. We're going to be talking about QuickBooks and independent contractor versus employee, how to pay your taxes. These are for new doctors coming out, but also for doctors who are new practice owners. So with that, I will say good night to everyone. Thank you very much for attending, and we will see you next time. And be safe, everyone. Good night.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.